But a machine doesn't want anything. I always ask people, what does ChatGPT do between prompts? Is it getting bored? What does it do? It does nothing. It's just a pattern of bits in a storage medium. It's nothing. It doesn't exist really more than that.
Hang out with Nam and Suleiman.
Hi, Johannes. Thanks for joining in. So we are Mindrift, the club at LPI. And as you know, like we all know, we're going to have you on Friday for our masterclass. So directly jumping into the question, what is the masterclass going to be about?
The masterclass is, I'll be frank about a book I'm writing. So I'm not trying to sell you the book, but I'm trying to get one point across. I think science in the 21st century needs to be reformed, and it needs to move away, especially from the view that the world is a machine. And I'm going to argue in the masterclass two things. First of all, that this machine is not necessary, this machine view, for science, to do science, which a lot of people actually think. And the second is I want to just give you a few hints what such a science would look like and how you do science without treating the world as if it is a machine.
That is interesting. What do you see as broken in the world as machine picture? What motivated you to write this book?
So I want to give you a very specific example. The current instantiation of this idea, it used to be the clockwork universe when our best technology was clocks. And nowadays, of course, it's the idea that everything in physics is computation. The world is a computer. And I think many people don't take this as a metaphor anymore, but they literally think that physics is computation. That's an example of treating the world as a machine, because of course you can program your computer, you can control your computer, and you can completely understand your computer. It's an engineered artifact. But the world is not at all like a computer, which will be a large part of my talk, will be about showing first how this idea originated and developed, and that it's quite recent, and that it's not based on any evidence or logical thinking. It's just an assumption.
That's very interesting. So, because, but before actually jumping into the topic, I want to ask you that, like, what inspired you to this problem? Like, what motivation to let, like, why people need to care about that?
That's a great question. I have two things to say here. First, I was inspired. I was a computational modeler myself for a long time, and I ran a lab in Barcelona studying the evolution of gene networks in flies using computational models and reverse engineering. It's a very classical machine view of the world approaches. And of course, when you do this, you're becoming very aware of the limitations of your own model. So if you think about it, we're using methods from 18th century physics, basically, to study living organisms. And it became clear to me that that's completely inadequate, basically. So the first was this methodological approach. The second was sort of noticing that a lot of the people who want the world to be a machine, they have very strange political and social views. Especially in Silicon Valley right now, you have a sort of an ideology that's called transhumanism. So the idea is that we will take our human evolution in our own hands, and there is a very good-looking vision that we will cure all diseases and we will upload our minds and then go and conquer the galaxy. And I think that's a disastrously naive view, and is creating a lot of damage right now. You can see how people who hold this view, like Elon Musk is the most famous example, but also Peter Thiel, people who want to live forever, people who hold this view behave in very pathological ways. And so I started seeing the connections between these two things, that we have come to view the world as our toy, but at the same time, I, as someone who did cutting edge research, was very much aware of the limitations of our tools. And so I became aware that this is a complete illusion, and the hubris of these people will be very dangerous, because they will have take actions that will have global unintended consequences, and those consequences are unlikely to be good. We already see the unraveling of geopolitics, of the climate, of ecosystems, of our social cohesion. These are all secondary. Nobody intended this to happen when they introduced new technologies, but there we are. And so the basic insight from complexity science that I want everybody to take home from my talk is, when you manipulate a complex system, there will be unintended consequences. And a science that goes beyond the age of machines has this as a very, very first principle. So when you manipulate things, when you release GMO organisms, genetically manipulated organisms into the environment, you have to bear in mind that this will have consequences that you can't necessarily predict.
Just to follow up on what you said about the Silicon Valley, could you give what do you think about Elon Musk and Peter Thiel? What are they doing that is influencing?
So beyond my personal assessment of these people, there's something that is, I think, very interesting. I think we can subdivide knowledge into propositional knowledge, which is when you have a database in your head and you have a lot of facts that are actually true, that's propositional knowledge. Then there is sort of practical knowledge, know-how, skills. You can explain to someone how to ride a bike, but they can't ride the bike. They have to practice it themselves. But there are two more kinds of knowledge. One is called perspectival knowledge. It's sort of knowing who you are and how you relate to the world. And the second one is called I always forget that one, but it's basically the ability to read the room. Okay, so to know what other people actually want to hear. And I think it's called participatory knowledge. That's it. So basically, this is a subdivision by John Vervaeke who came up with this. And it's very useful because people who are good at factual knowledge are very often bad at knowing how to do things, bad at knowing their relationship, where they stand, and their relationship to the world. If this is broken, we have hubris, we have the overestimation of one's own capabilities, and of course, doing the right thing in the right moment, reading the room, and knowing how to react, what to talk about. They completely suck at this, and we probably all are somewhere on this multidimensional spectrum of intelligences, but they don't necessarily correlate with each other. So what I think in these kind of types, tech barons, overlords right now, what we have is a complete imbalance between what I would call knowledge and wisdom. They do well on IQ tests. They have a lot of propositional knowledge about technology, but they're really bad at taking perspectives of other people and even realizing that other people have valuable perspectives and problems. And they're, of course, very bad at doing the right thing in a given situation. And so I became very curious about this imbalance. And I think we need to cultivate in a science for the 21st century all of those different skills and employ them in the best way, because the aim of basic science is and has always been and should be, but in practice not always, is to basically understand ourselves and our relationship with the world better. It's not primarily to develop new technologies or medicines or things like that. That comes out of this. And it's actually a necessary first step to first understand ourselves and our relationship to the universe. But it's often been forgotten these days and people think, politicians especially, that you can skip this theoretical, useless kind of science and then go straight to the applied part. A nice example from history is under President Obama, the war on cancer. I don't know if you realize that the war on cancer has not exactly been won, right? So there were billions invested in curing cancer, and it was declared as a war on cancer. So we just put a load of money into applied research without thinking about the principles. And there's since then been a revolution, a conceptual revolution in cancer medicine to the systems level, away from the idea that there's specific genes, oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes that are responsible for cancer and not, but that everything happens at this tissue level. So the new view of cancer is tissue level field theories. And so sometimes we are so focused on technology, also sometimes at the LPI, that we forget that behind that technology, you have to have the right concepts to do the right kind of experiments, to ask the right kind of questions.
So I want to jump into the age of machines, which is something that you're mentioning in the book. One question for you is what is gained and lost by treating the world as a machine?
So what was gained is obvious, right? I mean, we have science, we have even ideas about humanism and democracy came out of that age after the scientific revolution, and have to be seen as sort of an empirical success of modernity. I would call that the age of modernity from the scientific revolution onward to today. So I think we've sort of reached the end of modernity. We're already entering clearly something called...
What do you mean by scientific revolution? Like, which age are you referring to?
Well, so Newton and before, the Galileo and
Oh, way back.
yeah. So there's a nice book by Stephen Shapin. Is he called Stephen? I don't know, but it's a historian, and he has this funny thesis. He said the scientific revolution didn't exist, but here's a book about it. And what he means by that is it happened over an extended time from the 17th to the 18th century, involved only the elites. Most of the world was not undergoing any kind of revolution, but just a few, really literally dozen of men at the time. And he describes the social circumstances and then also the consequences of this event, which led to what we could call the age of modernity, the age of technology, the age of trying to control the world. And out of that came huge advancements for humanity in medicine, in technology, in general living standards, but also a bunch of things that were lost. And it led to this postmodern revolution that we're undergoing right now, where we're starting to deconstruct all the concepts and the uses of technology that we have today. And there's a problem because we cannot just deconstruct. Everything is falling apart. People are now saying, okay, whatever I say is the truth. We live in this post-truth world. So this is postmodern, right? And so the idea for me would be, I also write about metamodern science for the 21st century. And metamodern is what rebuilds after postmodernism, a new kind of science that acknowledges that science is also based on individual and collective experiences of human beings and maybe our ancestors as well. But you have nothing like a naive, objective knowledge. We cannot jump out of our head and have a view from nowhere. Science is always a view from somewhere. It's a particularly human view, but it's not just arbitrary either. It's not just, you cannot just say something and say, this is the truth because I make it so, because the truth arises from your interaction with a reality that is much bigger than you. So reality, you could define reality basically as that part of your experience that you just cannot control, right? You get up in the morning and so many things happen to you. The day doesn't usually go to plan. And this is scaring a lot of people, but this is what reality is. We encounter reality every day and we have no control over that. So we adapt to that reality, hopefully. We have stopped doing that a little bit. And I think that's the most dangerous moment in human history, where we have actually decided that we can determine ourselves what reality is. But I think reality has a tendency to come after you if you ignore it for too long. So this is also why I'm calling for a new kind of science. It has to be rooted. It has to be a true philosophical revolution. We have to root science in ourselves. There's nothing else. So it's an evolutionary view of knowledge. And it's not this kind of idea that we can absolutely understand anything.
Possible, could you give us like 3 examples of how the new science is different than the original science that we are aware of?
Yeah. So new science. The first is a very general example, and it's good news for everybody who's using old science tools like computational models. It's okay to still do the experiments you were doing before, to model the world with computational models like you did before. But you will realize that these models, they are not more real than the real world that you live in. I always like to use this example of, you can simulate your bike perfectly, but you can't write that simulation to work. This is a distinction that seems bleedingly obvious to everyone, but is often forgotten when you hear discussions about AI. Is AI conscious? It's a simulation of something, but we don't know even what consciousness is. So we have to make that distinction. So in this new science, you will not come up with a new technology and think, hey, this is how the world looks like. Because look, I have a really cool computer the size of my pocket. I have this phone that I can put, and this is the coolest technology we've ever come up with. This was just like the clockworks in the 17th century. They were so cool that everybody suddenly thought the world was a clock. And now our computers are so cool that we think the world is a computer. So you wouldn't do this anymore. So this is a very abstract example, right? So what are the more specific examples? One I've already given to you, and I think as a biologist is extremely important to me. I think cancer biology and research has been delayed by about 30 years by thinking about it in a reductionist way, which was completely wrong. So that identifying single targeted mutations that are causing a cancer. Cancers, unfortunately, are a very individual disease. Everybody has different mutations, and it's always a whole set of mutations. And of course, the genes that are involved are not cancer genes. They didn't evolve to cause cancer. They regulate growth processes. That's the bad thing. They usually regulate growth processes in cells, and we know that every gene basically in a cell is involved in regulating growth in some way or another, directly or indirectly. So we have to think about these network effects. We have to think about the different levels of organization that cancer works in. So you wouldn't naturally think this way, that cancer is a complex multi-level disease, and then you would have to justify why use a specific model targeting a specific level, instead of saying, okay, we are just going to study oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes. And I do think research was held back, and a lot of people prematurely died for that reason. So it's not just a philosophical issue. And then the last example is my favorite example, because it's what I work on and there's no other reason. And that is the science of the organism. Why don't we understand life? And why does biology not even ask the question what life is anymore? And that is connected also with the discussion we have about AI, by the way. That's really closely connected, because what I would claim is that there's pretty good evidence that what makes living systems alive is that they're just normal matter that's organized in a very unusual way. It's very fluid, dynamic. It's complex in a very different way than a self-organizing system like a candle flame is. It doesn't just dissipate energy, it reinvests that energy into its own existence. It has agency, so there are actions that come from within that organization. And I was, as a biologist, always struck how we don't even have the tools to understand and study that. And this is something that we would ask immediately, why is it possible that for about 70 years now, since we discovered DNA, biologists have just been focusing on molecules and mechanisms, and then have been believing that if you just study enough mechanisms, the meaning of life is going to jump out at you at some point, miraculously. And that's not happened for 70 years. And I think it's never going to happen, because we simply lack the right concepts, the right ideas, the right questions to ask what life really is. So my own research is going beyond the age of machine, because there is work by a theoretical biologist called Robert Rosen from the 1950s already that is showing, using a very rigorous mathematical proof using category theory, that the kind of systems that living systems have to be, if they behave the way they do, is not the same as a Newtonian mechanism. It's simply not the same category of systems. And so we have to move beyond the age of machines, quite literally in biology, if we want to understand a whole living cell, a whole living organism, or ecosystems, or any system up to social systems and economies that contain living systems that behave in ways that mechanical systems don't. And our sciences, especially economics, is failing at that. That's why it's often called the dismal science, and it assumes that people behave in computable, rational ways, which is why all economic systems go so terribly wrong, to be honest. Yeah. So these are examples, and the last example also goes into AI, because what we call intelligence in computers is completely different from what we call intelligence in organisms. And you can only understand that if you know that organisms are very different, are organized completely differently than an algorithm or a computer that it runs on is. And then we would have a very different, if we would be aware of this, we would have a very different discussion about AI and what it can actually do. Sorry, that was very long, but you asked for 3 examples, so yeah.
No, it's all good. Zoe, do we have a question?
Yes. So very, very interesting. But I'm curious, because you mentioned how, the Peter Thiels and the Elon Musk, that they have all this influence in Silicon Valley and others like them, but they're just not doing it right. And then you bring in your perspective of the metamodern science. So 2 questions. First, because these people are so influential, right? And like a lot of young people sort of follow that direction. What would you have these like really influential people do differently that aligns more so with the perspective of science you want people to sort of go more into? And then I'll ask my follow-up question after you answer this one.
Great, because I'll probably forget in the meantime, so hold on to
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
This is a great question. I think, for example, if you look at what AI as a business is right now, I strongly suspect that the business model, the only business model that I could see is actually profitable, is if you would manage to massively replace people with AI algorithms. Okay, only then does this massive investment, you can look these numbers up. I mean, they've invested more than $1 trillion in a business that has made a few billion in return. So the discrepancy between investments and any sort of profit coming out of this system is as massive as nothing has ever been. I mean, people compare this to the dot-com bubble and say, oh, we got the whole fiber optic internet out of that, even if all the companies crash. But this is an industry that is producing literally nothing for a lot of investments. So what are they going to do to be profitable? They have to replace people with algorithms. Now, the question is, there's always this talk about artificial general intelligence, AGI, or artificial superintelligence, ASI. And the question is, what do these words mean? And I tell you what, they mean absolutely nothing, because what they are talking about is just a system that is very good at mathematical problem solving, very fast. And computers have always been better than we at that. So we should use this technology to, replace humans when it's about holding a lot of different information in your head at the same time, when you need to find very high dimensional correlations in a problem. That's why it's so good for predicting protein folding structures and things like that. That's why it's so good at diagnosing images, for which you have huge databases in medicine. This is why it's probably going to find some patterns in whale speech. They probably just are telling us to leave them alone or something in the end, but it'll be interesting to understand what the whales have to say. But here we have a model that aims at something very different, at replacing people in the workforce with AI. And what's missing there is, I will argue in my talk, that the organization of the organism, the reason why it's so different from non-living systems is exactly what makes it an agent. And you have to be an agent to make decisions, to be creative, to bear responsibility, because you need to want something. And you can't make a machine. You can make a machine want something. You can make it imitate the want of something, but a machine doesn't want anything. I always ask people, what does ChatGPT do between prompts? Is it getting bored? What does it do? It does nothing. It's just a pattern of bits in a storage medium. It's nothing. It doesn't exist really more than that. And living beings, of course, are very different. They have to keep themselves constantly alive. So you have to prioritize. You have to know what's good and what's bad for you. So value, meaning comes into only play when you're a living system and not an algorithm. So if you look at AI that way, then you immediately realize that the whole meaning that these systems produce has been put into the curation of the data set, has been put in the training procedures, has been put in the prompts by human users. So the AI by itself produces no meaning unless it interacts with a human being. And all of the meaning is produced on the human side. So if you replace your entire company with AIs, you have a problem, because there's no responsibility, accountability, decision power, creativity in there anymore. And it becomes immediately clear that this business model is completely absurd. And we would probably stop investing trillions of dollars into what I think is a black hole of investment. I mean, even worse, it destroys the planet. The data centers that we're building are very specific. This bubble is not going to leave infrastructure that's useful. It's just going to leave a mass of data centers that are deprecated after a few months already and not usable anymore, because these GPUs fry very quickly. And anyway, you can't use them unless you have a huge amount of energy and water to run and cool them. So this is not useful technology that we're producing, and we would have a very different discussion, and people would see much more clearly, a broader layer of people, what these problems are. And I'm always surprised how people have completely naive imaginings, have naive ideas about what the AI can actually do, because it's very good at imitating our language behavior, and we fall for these kind of imitations very easily. Sorry, long answer, but I mean, that's why I think it's crucial to think about especially living beings in a very different way, beyond the machine right now.
So just to piggyback off of that, why do you think it's so easy for us as people to sort of like fall for these things?
Yeah. So we have
the
evolved,
AI especially. Yeah.
Thanks for this question. We have evolved this detector of agency. So you lay in the meadow, you look up at the clouds and you see all kinds of figures in the clouds. So and you also there's this nice installation that you often see in science museums where there's a laser pointer, and a little feedback mechanism that avoids shadows on the wall. So if then people go into the room and you try to go and reach the laser pointer dot, it runs away from you. It's a simple negative feedback loop. There's nothing behind it but an automated negative feedback loop. And then you interview the people coming out, from children up to old people, all age ranges, all backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, all genders. They say, there is someone sitting behind the scenes moving the dot. So we have this hyperactive agency detector. There's a whole literature even in evolutionary behavioral biology about this. And this was probably really important when you're a hunter in the woods who is trying to see prey among the non-moving environment. But it's very dangerous right now because obviously these chatbots are designed in a way that makes it very easy for us to mistake them. I would say we need to have not AI, but IA, intelligence augmentation. I did not invent this term and I always forget who did, so I should acknowledge them here. But intelligence augmentation is a tool that helps us in those cases where our brain capacities are limited, but it doesn't replace us in jobs that should be creative, responsible, and anything that requires judgment. That is just a sort of what philosophers call a category error. So you're replacing an agent, a human being, with a machine that has no agency at all.
So it seems that sort of moving toward IA kind of keeps the human being's role in society still quite central because we need that human behavior, the agency, and so on.
Exactly. So there's this nice little meme that said, I thought the machines would do the cleaning and the boring jobs and not the poetry and the and the planning. And this is, I mean, this sort of business model of AI right now is so upside down. And I think you see that once you get these philosophical ideas that I'm trying to present, then it's like it switches in your brain. There's a different frame, the background is suddenly the foreground, like one of these Necker cubes that either go out one way or another in 3D. And you can't unsee this. You just see what's happening there. And of course, then the argument is, but we can build machines that act as if they have decision power, But eventually we'll end up in a closed loop of machine planning. And when there's a situation that, requires real human improvisation and decision power, then will fail. And we, just like with the hallucinations, we'll never know when that happens. It'll happen at some point, I'm sure. And so it's an extremely dangerous technology if you, for example, delegate decision authority and responsibility to it. That's why self-driving cars are such a problem.
I guess it's also about determinism, right? Because it's just like very comfortable, and that's why people fall to it.
So I have noticed, discussing with people who believe in the machine view of the world, who believe the world is a computer, that there's not a rational motivation behind this, but mostly an emotional need. Why do a lot of us prefer the company of our laptop instead of the company of other people? Let's be honest, right? You know people in your environment that are like that. It's because it's controllable. We know how it works. And I like computers that way. And so the world is scary because it's not like that at all. But it's very important for us to recognize at a young age that we cannot control what's happening in any complex environment like we can control our own technology in this very private little setting. And even there, I mean, you know how things go wrong with your computer as well. Sometimes there are very real limitations that are very scary and actually emotionally troubling for a lot of people who have a high need for control and security. Okay, so then there's another breed of people that are just happy. They get very claustrophobic in a machine world, and they needed the future to be open. Now, if you look at the evidence that we have from studying our own science and everything like that, there's a paradox in the history of science. If you could predict what science will do in 30 years, for example, what it would discover, then you would have already made the discovery. So since you cannot, predict the entirety of the future of science, we know the universe is open. Yeah, we know that we are limited beings, and what we know about the universe will always be biased, partial, and incomplete, and quite a lot of it probably just plain wrong. And once we've sort of find peace with this very scary world in which we live, in which a lot of it is not understandable, without sliding into the opposite, like this mysterianism that a lot of people have, that they want all this mystery. They say, oh, if we would find, understand the chemistry behind love would not be enjoyable anymore. What? Okay, if I know which hormones are involved, I'm still enjoying falling in love just as much as before, because that's the subjective side, the experience of it. And if you have this metamodern view of how science is anchored, it's a tool for us to understand our world, and the future is fundamentally, radically open, and we never know everything with absolute certainty, then you can make peace while still having a certain reassurance. You can be reassured that how we interact with the world can be improved. Still, it's not just anything goes, we're lost. Every opinion is the same. No, some opinions in some situations are better than others, and we can still make that decision based on our experience. What is good for us right now? We just can't know what's good for all times for everybody in the universe, and that's okay, right? I think if you make peace with this, you can have the best of both worlds. You can have the open future, and you can have confidence that you actually have a good tool in science to understand the world as far as it goes.
Go on.
Okay. Last question. So just to take it a bit back as well, when you had mentioned how with the economics is sort of like the dismal science, from your view, if we move in the direction of metamodern science and into a new science, because in economics now we keep studying people in a computational way, and we want to make people seem like they are sort of robots when they're not. But if we move into a metamodern science, how do you think that will change not necessarily the study of economics, but the way economics is implemented without seeing people as computational, which I know is necessary because that's my background. So it's fascinating for me. And I agree with you that most of the economies are not doing well and they're not thriving at all. So I'm curious to see, if we do take this direction, what do you think the outcome would be for economies and economics as a theory and study in general?
Thanks for this question. I have two answers for you packed into one. And so the first is that we have to realize that as a limited being, there's some progress in this direction. Ecological economics or behavioral economics talk about how do we react in our ecology, right? In our situation. And that's not always rational. Why not? Because the rational thing to do, the computationally optimal thing to do, is often not the right thing to do. And so the reason for this is very simple. And I've written a paper about this with my former student, Anna Riedel, and other authors. And that is the first task of any limited being in the real world if it comes to taking a decision. So the foundation of decision theory should be to realize what is relevant in your environment. When you get up in the morning and look around, you don't know what's going to be important today. So you have to figure it out. And that is not a problem that is well defined algorithmically, that cannot be formalized, because it is the process of actually formalizing your problems. And only once you formalize them, you've made them abstract, can you solve them. Every economic model, even if it includes biases and heuristics and everything, focuses on the problem solving instead of the problem framing part of that question. So we need a complete new decision theory that is based on this first step of realizing what is relevant in the first place. And that is very interesting. If you look at what we value in economics nowadays, which wasn't the case just 30 years ago, is shareholder profit and cash flow, okay? And so these are arbitrary measures for economic well-being. And we know that a lot of people most people fare very badly under this, but we can still present, we have the metrics, GDP and all these that give us the impression that we're making progress economically and there's growth because we believe in these measures, right? So the added value that comes back in our debt-driven economy is based on increasing cash flow and nothing else, and not actually creating real world value. So this is directly, these two sort of answers that I give you here are directly connected. So the bad news is, of course, that not all of this is entirely formalizable. So the models we have will always be limited, always, for a system like economics or any other, an ecosystem, any system that contains living beings that make irrational choices because they have not just limited information, because they have motivations that are not always good faith and are not always good for everyone in a given situation. We need to move away from this idea that we can precisely compute what people will do in any kind of situation. So we have tools that are limited, but then I would say they're not useless as long as you understand what their limitations are. But if you have a neoclassical rational choice model, and there is one of my favorite philosophers is Bill Wimsatt. He's one of the people who came up with this perspectival realism idea that I was describing before, that all knowledge is based on our experience, but in the interaction with reality. So he says these models are so bad. Usually we learn from mistakes in our models or limitations from our models, but these models are so wrong that we should basically just discard them. The question is always then what follows up on that, and science never discards something if there isn't sort of something to replace it with. And here we have to sort of give up the hope that we will have another model that completely predicts the economy based on new principles. Just one example for that. So if you had a model that would actually predict the financial market accurately, everybody would adopt the model, and the financial market would look nothing like it did when you invented that model. Immediately would be completely changed, and the model wouldn't predict it. There's a paradox there, right? You're modeling a system that contains the modeler. Okay, that's what Hofstadter called a strange loop. Okay, and these strange loops are hidden everywhere, and they lead to mathematical paradoxes and to limitations of what can be formalized. Super interesting.
Is it okay if I give a summary of what I understood from this conversation? And can you correct me if I'm wrong? So basically what I see is that the world now is a sort of a demon that sees everything as a machine, as a tool, as a technology, in a way. And we're hitting the limitation where this is not going to work for the future. Some change needs to happen because it brings all the negativity of Silicon Valley, like a small number of people deciding for a large number of population, and it kills creativity, culture, and yada, yada, yada. I understood that part, and I understood that people fall for determinism, but apart from accepting that the world is open, the world is free, and cannot be viewed as a machine, what are some practical steps, let's say me as a scientist, I could do towards the how did you call it?
Metamodern science. Yeah.
Metamodern science.
So the steps you can do is, first of all, scientists have to become more aware of how knowledge is created. So we have to have more of an education of how knowledge is created, because a lot of people are a little bit confused or completely wrong, even in science, how science works, right? We have this old-fashioned idea that we have a bunch of hypotheses, they are rationally constructed, and then we test them and they fail, and then science progresses steadily like an asymptotic line towards the truth. And that is called objectivist realism. That's not actually how science works at all. Science is messy, as you know, if you are in a postgraduate course already. You guys are just starting to make this experience. You have science from the textbook until you have your bachelor's degree, and then you go into your master's and PhD projects, and you're looking for a black cat in a dark room, and you don't even know if the cat is there. So it's a very different sort of procedure, and then it's messy with human interactions, and that's all part of it. So this seems like an incredibly theoretical discussion, but I think if you're aware of this, then you become a better scientist because you know what game you're actually playing. And so you have very direct benefits over your colleagues because you know that your experiment and your model and everything is an abstraction, a limited abstraction. You know what it's good for and what it's not. That will help you with the interpretation. And then it will help you greatly with asking interesting questions. In a lot of the sciences that we have today, people no longer ask interesting questions, and unfortunately, biology included. It's so important to think about this. Where your questions come from is not a rational computational process, right? It's driven by all kinds of accidents that happened in your life. We can talk about my career. You had in the Google Doc, you asked, how do you get there? And I can tell you it's a series of accidents from here where I am. And so with curiosity and everything, you bring everything that you think makes it easy to do a scientific career into science, and then you realize never actually does anything work out the way you planned it. And that's exactly a feature of your career. So the second thing you're doing is you're going about the career in science as if you were an artist and no longer a career office worker. Okay, so you are creating new knowledge, and nobody, if you go into art, nobody guarantees you that you will create meaningful art that will be meaningful to other people. So nobody in science can guarantee you that you will produce insights that will be important. And sometimes the things that you thought were not important become important. That happened to me over and over again. Or things you do become important among people that you didn't even think about. I never thought about, I had a guy from Buddhism studies writing to me about relevance realization and how that helps them. And I was like, whoa, I didn't even know you guys did these kind of things. And so this is really gratifying. So because you then have this process view of open, the world is an open evolutionary process, you will also put much less pressure on yourself to succeed. And you will say, I take this as it comes out, give it my best. And it's not my fault if it doesn't work out the way it did. And I see a lot of mental anguish and anxiety among young scientists because there's a lot of pressure that often comes from within yourself to succeed in this specific machine model of academia that we've built up. So we've built academia as if you are all machines, right? You just need to produce more and more papers to succeed. When in fact, it's all about creating your own niche and being creative, making the right decisions, all these things that only humans can do. You will not be replaced by an AI anytime soon because AIs will not come up with interesting questions. And that's already there's been studies there was a recent one again where they tried to have AIs produce interesting hypotheses and it failed miserably. So this is something, you pay attention to completely different aspects of your career, and you also go about it in a very different way that is much more, it's much more lenient towards yourself, okay? There is no guarantee that you will succeed in this. Nobody goes into art saying, you go and say, I want to be a famous artist, but you don't go into an art career saying, I will be a famous artist. That's just crazy. And I think that takes a lot of load off your shoulders, basically. Sorry, a very long answer, but a very important question, I think.
No, I totally get it. Also, staying on the philosophical side, what do you think would happen if there were no scientists that would care about this?
Okay, so what happens can be seen in molecular biology, for example. It is an industry that produces massive data sets that nobody uses for anything useful anymore, if we're honest. And I mean, that's a little bit of a caricature. Of course, you can. So now what is the solution? Now we're going to put AI onto these data sets and it will find all kinds of interesting things. If you're not looking for anything interesting, you're not very likely to go and find anything interesting, even with AI, right? I mean, so what we need to do instead is to sit down and say, what is it that we want to know about life? Did we actually measure the right thing? Mountains of data. Did we measure the right thing? Is this what we wanted? Is this useful? Most of it is probably not useful. It's just random noise, to be honest. This low replication number data sets, huge data sets that are probably going to be entirely useless. I'm afraid, because they mostly measure noise. Single cell sequencing is a nice and specific example. I mean, most variations between cells is absolutely unimportant to the cell's behavioral repertoire, I think.
I feel like the trust scientists will also be lost. Something
absolutely,
that I saw,
yeah. Thanks.
Something that I saw from. Sorry, go on.
No, that was the next thing I was actually going to come to. So thanks for that, because then we, like every big project, right? Like the Human Genome Project, if you take that, or even more spectacularly, the Brain Project, gave us promises that were completely stellar. AI research right now. Okay, the promises are so big, they're never going to be realized. And so wave after wave of these big, humongous projects. I mean, AI is just beyond any order of magnitude. I mean, AI is going to be the biggest disappointment ever. And then scientists are going to be blamed instead of snake oil vendors like Sam Altman and Amodei and all these fraud. These people are fraudulent. Okay, they lie to everybody all the time because they know what's going on behind the scenes. They know that these systems have been plateauing. They know what these systems can't do, and scaling isn't going to work in the end. But they have to raise money, so they are For me, this is a case of fraud, but the same way that Henry Markram announced the Human Brain Project with a 3D simulation of neurons, saying, okay, we'll have consciousness in the brain in 5 years. And 1 year later, the whole thing fell apart because it was completely overhyped. And we are in these constant hype cycles right now. They're disastrous for the trust in science. They're disastrous for our own sanity. They're disastrous for science itself. A lot of we're really drowning in bullshit right now in science itself, not just all in the rest of society as well. So we're compromising our own scientific knowledge by rushing ahead into things that are not serious. I'm sorry, are not are just like driven by hopium. You know, this kind of idea that the miracle technology will come along and save us, and it's a very, very, very tempting vision. It's a salvation narrative. The church used to do that. Okay, so you die and you go to heaven. Now you die and you upload your brain into the cloud. I mean, the gods have just been replaced by some technology that
But do you think it's the problem with the technology? Because, well, even before ChatGPT existed, for example, in our university, when I joined as a research assistant to my professor, what happened was he gave me a bunch of papers saying, read this, and then find the gap that you want to research about, and I'll be your supervisor. So basically, he was like, it's quantity over quality. And in a lot of places, it's quantity over quality as well.
So yes and no. Of course, every time we invent a new technology, we change as well, right? I mean, it's a two-way interaction. Our behavior changes. One funny example that I always think about is people saying on the phone, hey, I'm on a train. Or, hey, I'm there and there. Before mobile phones, nobody ever said that, because you would call a landline and you would always know where somebody was that you called. So nobody ever said, hey, I'm here or I'm there. And so this is a very innocent example of how our use of language has radically changed, but you can find the change in social norms and all kinds of things. So another interesting study is the loss of sarcasm in European children. So sarcasm, a sense of sarcasm develops outside of the US among children when you're about 13 or 14. Yeah. Mm-hmm. In some cultures more than others, but it does. And so the AIs are completely incapable of actual sarcasm. So kids that interact with AIs more than real people have no sense of sarcasm. They become Americans, basically. That's so this is already measurable. And so human behavior will change. But what I think we have to remember, and what my vision of AI shows you, is that in the end, the agency lies with you. So what we're suffering from right now is a technology used, employed in a very complex societal environment. But in the end, it's us human agents who built this society, including the bullshit business model of US capitalism combined with AI, a complete disaster. I'm not necessarily anti-capitalist when it comes to olive oil or a toothbrush. I want the best possible toothbrush. I want the best possible olive oil. But when it comes to having to drive a sort of a research effort like this, it's a total disaster, because everything becomes enveloped in bullshit. I mean, I'm using this term not as an offensive term. There is a book, the best-selling philosophy book of all time is Harry Frankfurt's book that's called On Bullshit. And bullshit is not lying, because a lie is concerned with hiding the truth. And Frankfurt says bullshit is not concerned with lying the truth, but with hyping the bullshitter. Okay? So a bullshitter is no longer concerned with the truth. And this is typical, again, of the postmodern age that we live in. It's much more important to self-promote, to become successful like that, than to actually create real world value. And we need to get back to that. We are detaching ourselves from reality right now. And so this is something that the technology cannot be blamed for. This is an absolute direct consequence of a specific economic and political system that we've built up, that is creating all the problems with populism and democracy right now. It's a natural consequence. But the promising thing here is that if you buy my ideas, then you know that we have agency. We are human agents. We can change the future. And we never know how that works, because it's a bigger than us system. I don't like the term superorganism, because it's not like an organism, but it's like a big monster that we've created. Some people call it Moloch or some other biblical monster, Leviathan. I don't think those are good. They're also organisms. So I would just say there's a dynamic that's much bigger than us. So we don't know what's going to be good. So what we need is a sort of a swarm intelligence for the future. I like the maker attitude at the LPI that we have to have lots of different ways of people building different solutions to problems that we don't yet know are going to be problems in the future. And so I think this is extremely important right now, to reaffirm, to reconquer our own agency from the machines. It's not the technology. So I always say I used to write in a paper that it's not Skynet, but Facebook that kills us. But now it's not Skynet, but ChatGPT that will kill us. So it's these little tools that we built that are not AGIs. They're not going to take over the world. They don't want anything. How does Skynet want to take over the world? Skynet is a computer. So we are building tools that we no longer understand. So basically we're like this, Goethe's sorcerer apprentice that most people know from Disney that has these brooms that go out of control. And so this is what's happening right now. But we can become sorcerers again and get those brooms under control if we just realize that we have the agency, that we need to democratically build these systems, and that we have a say. And we have to have a say. Of course, all these people that I mentioned before, the Thiels and the Musks of the world, are trying to create an undemocratic, feudal, neo-feudal system right now where only they have a say, and you will be their serfs. You have nothing. 99.999% of humanity will have nothing to say. The good thing is we are 99.999% of humanity, so we need to learn to cooperate again, to find overlapping consensus on these things. And maybe someday, literally go with the pitchfork and the flare to those few people who have all the control. But it's a very worrisome development that these people are grabbing so much control, because we need all of this to be democratically controlled. I think that's something the LPI is explicitly working on. But it's more important than ever to talk about this, and also to talk about how these deeper philosophical ideas that I was trying to explain to you, this computationalism, the machine view, are underlying this very undemocratic push that's happening right now. These are deeply connected developments, okay? So, and only if you see that can you, make the deeper changes that are necessary right now.
Speaking about LPI and also the masterclass that we're going to have, what do you think are some questions that you want students to struggle for a meeting?
I want to not seed any questions here. I want to really know what people worry about, what they think. I want all kinds of questions that worry you. So I really don't think, as I said, we need the swarm intelligence, right? So I'm not there to tell you how you see the world. I will be happy if you develop a different view of seeing the world, but that you actually self-reflect and you develop your own view of the world. You don't just follow. I mean, I think the reason that we end up in certain patterns in society that are no longer working, and that's outside science as much as inside science, that's often surprising. Our social cohesion is falling apart. The traditional family model is not working anymore because of the economic circumstances that we have now that are no longer the same as in the 1950s when this traditional models was developed. But also in science, we often think science is so much removed from all this societal upheaval that it's not affected. But I think a lot of the ways in which we do science are no longer valid. And I would like to develop everyone in that audience their own approach to science, their own perspective that they can argue. So there's two kinds of pluralism. Pluralism is if you value different ideas. Mm-hmm. And there's a nice paper by Bernstein from 1989, I think it is, where he distinguishes what he calls engaged and flabby pluralism. My friend Dan calls flabby pluralism group hug pluralism. Everybody in the room has an opinion, and some of them are clearly stupid. But we all say, oh, everybody's entitled to their opinion. No. Okay? There has to be a good argument for your view. Yeah. And then pluralism is useful because we do all bring something different to the table. So this feminist philosophers of science call this a standpoint. A standpoint is a perspective that is directly affected by a problem. We all come from different backgrounds. We have different motivations. We are different people in all kinds of ways. And every one of us brings new questions to the table and is interested in different questions. And so to have a standpoint in that radical feminist sense, but also all kinds of other senses, is to be involved, directly affected by a problem and wanting to contribute to a solution. So this is how you go into science. You pick the problems you want to solve. That's not a rational process. And you put your engagement in there. And in the best of cases, you develop your own way of looking at the problem. And this even happens in mathematics. There's all these examples of mathematics is not an algorithmic logical research at all. Because it often depends on, there's so many questions you could potentially ask. What are the questions that you're actually asking? And it turns out that, for example, female mathematicians often ask different questions or use different methods than male mathematicians. And 90-something% of mathematicians are male. So this is a real problem. So this is the kind of diversity and pluralism that we need, an engaged pluralism that brings in the kind of diversity that is important for the problems that we want to solve, but not both sides saying issues where you go, okay, if somebody just denies climate change, we have to present both sides. Nope, because that is not a valid view, because it's clearly contradicted by evidence. And we do know perspectivism is not relativism. We do know that one of these views is robust, it's reflecting how reality actually is, and the other one is not. Whoever is denying climate change is clearly completely delusional. I'm from a mountain village in the Swiss mountains. The farmers there are very conservative. I mean, they are the first people to tell you that the weather has completely changed over the last 30 years. And whoever denies that is just a liar. And so this is the difference between metamodern and postmodern. Postmodern says it's all just a discourse and anything could be true. I mean, this is also a caricature. I really know very few people who actually think like that. But metamodernism tries to come out of that and say, yes, we're imperfect or biased. All of knowledge comes out of that human perspective, but it's not just arbitrary or anything. It is hard work to engage with reality and to fall on your nose over and over again. That's what science is, to be wrong in interesting ways.
Yeah, so this is really interesting, but what I'm thinking about now is we mentioned questions a lot, and earlier on, it seems to be a theme that we're asking the wrong questions, especially with the old science, like biologists are not asking the right questions. And if we focus more on the theoretical biology, and then we can focus on the organism and so on. But like Suleiman was asking as well, when we bring it back to a practical level and at an individual level, as just normal people, how do we start asking the right questions? Or how do we get to the right questions? Are there like parameters or something? Because I think most of us, probably myself included, are scientists in academia, but we're probably still asking questions based on the old science because that's how we were taught to think.
Yeah.
So with this new era of science that you're introducing to us, how do we, begin to even start thinking from the problem perspective, and then so we can ask better questions or hypotheses for our research moving forward that would reflect a more metamodern sort of science moving forward, if that is clear.
Totally. First, a quick disclaimer. I think what we often try to do in today's society and science is everybody a genius, right? Everybody has to be an influencer. Everybody has to be famous. Everybody has to be the genius scientist that completely overhauls the science. If we would do that, and the LPI is especially, that force is especially strong at the LPI. They kind of expect you to be everyone a revolutionary, but nobody actually doing what you call normal science by normal people before. So hold your horses. Nobody is going to guarantee this. You have to get very lucky, apart from being a very talented young scientist, to actually get the opportunity to completely revolutionize your field. So forget about that. So you cannot force that to happen. Maybe it happens, but I think many bad things happen if everybody wants to be a shaman in the village suddenly. A whole village of shamans would be a very bad idea if you understand that metaphor. So that's the first caveat. But then there's a very simple recipe, I think. You said something interesting. You said, we as normal people. So first of all, I really like this sort of self-help book by a metamodern philosopher called Hansi Freinach, who said, we should all aspire to sublime mediocrity. And he said, everybody is mediocre on average on this planet. So And he presents a very simple model and says, assume that you have 1,000 different talents at which humans can be good at. That's a massive underestimate, probably. Then you have a very high probability of actually being in the top 10,000 people on the planet for one of them. Okay. So just by being normal. So I have a big plea here. Don't internalize the normal as average or boring or something like that. You being normal means that you have a special talent, quite probably just because you are you. And you come out of a specific context and you've worked your way up to where you are right now. So you are normal, but you're also special. And that's really true for all of you. So probably none of you will be the Newton of this generation, but who knows? I'm not going to exclude that either. But but you all have that potential to contribute something unique. And so then there's a very small practical advice that I have, and that is, I think it was a process philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who came up with this. And he said, okay, if you want to have a really good question, then look around and find that problem or that view that only you hold and everybody else either doesn't see as a problem or thinks it's crazy, but you think it's important and you have a good approach to it. And especially when you're a young scientist, often when you go after these ideas, they are crazy or somebody else, even sadder. I found out that mostly you find out later that somebody else had already done it. But if you go for these kind of things, these problems that everybody, if there's an excitement in a field, often everybody goes to this one thing. But, if you really want to lay the seeds for future progress, go for that one thing that really keeps you busy at night and nobody else seems to care about. And I think that's much better advice than to go for the big hype questions nowadays, because honestly, a lot of the hypes that we have in different fields are quite boring because everybody then suddenly goes to that one question. And I tell you something, true progress in science never comes out of the mainstream. That's just by definition the case. I mean, every new idea started as a minority idea that wasn't robust, that wasn't solid, that needed to be developed. And I'm a little bit afraid that this high pressure, high profile, high self promotion system that we've developed in academia is actually suffocating those original souls. And I think there was a question in the Google Doc, why are you happy to be a freelancer? Because it's much easier to do this kind of research outside of academia, sadly, nowadays. Unless you find a very good local environment where you get an established position and you teach and you do something, whatever you want to do. Yeah. So, yeah, I think there's hope. We are in a difficult moment for young academics for sure, but that also means that you are, and that's the last thing I'm going to say, so it's like a 4-part even, not just 3-part answer, I'm sorry. So that a time of change and really high pressure like this is a time where you can take more risk as well. Things are changing. And so the chance that you can actually do something risky and pull it off are actually higher nowadays, where we need change much more than in a time of what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, where no revolutions are happening. So the science is ready for a revolution, and these are exciting times to be in science. And as long as you don't put the pressure on yourself to say, I have to be that revolutionary, maybe you will be. And it's like looking for happiness. The more you look for happiness, the less you will find it. So this is kind of my advice. Don't look for that fame, but do what you do with the passion, and life will take you somewhere. Will take you places that are interesting, sometimes painful, but mostly interesting in that sort of environment that we're in. And that is a really big privilege to have. I always mention, think of these friends of yours that went into a banking career. They're probably a lot richer than you are right now, but also their lives are probably a lot less meaningful.
That gives us a lot to think about. Now, but Yogi, thank you very much for tuning in today. I think we had a very nice conversation, and I'm sure our peers at LPI will have fun listening to it. And yeah, thank you very much for this hour.
Thank you for all the excellent questions, and I don't envy you for having to cut this mess of what I said down to half an hour. Thanks a lot for doing this. This is a great project, and I really appreciate what you're doing here. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you all next week.
Yep. See you on Friday then.
We're gonna see you.
Yeah,
on
thank
Friday.
you.
Bye.
Bye.